how close to the time of the event did it happen? Okay, so if I write a biography about World War II, okay, that's decent. Like I can go and interview people who were around, or I can interview people who their grandparents told them. That's not bad. It's actually pretty good. It would be better if it was someone who was actually at Pearl Harbor to get a story of Pearl Harbor. But what would really be bad is if we came back in about 300-400 years and said, hey, here's a book written. It's pretty far afterwards. Like, how accurate is that going to be? Okay. Like I said, I'm still close enough that I can talk to people who knew people from then. So now would be a decent time I could probably write it and do the research and get it. But you get too far off and it gets too far away. So in this idea of talking about like how, and that's one of the things is they say, guys, you can't really trust them because they were written 90, 100, 150 years later and legend developed. Well, there's a couple problems with that. One, it's not true. Secondly, even if it was true, the time frames they're saying really aren't long enough to get. Let me see if I can say my notes here a little bit. Okay, let's go through the timing. Okay, a liberal dating, okay? So not a conservative, but a liberal dating. So like let's go as far as realistically possible. Let's make these Gospels look as old, as far away from the event as we can. So with a liberal dating, we put the book of Mark, AD 70, Matthew and Luke in the 80s, and John, the book of John, in the 90s. So you're thinking that's not actually 90 years, by the way, because you got to think the actual event they're talking about was in the 30s. So we're now talking about at the most extreme, the things they're writing about happened in AD 30, so we'll just say the 30s. They happened in the 30s, and the first writing about it was in the 70s. That's pretty close. Like we're talking about these people were still alive. And here's the other thing is, if you write something, okay, the pandemic, not that long ago. If I were to write a fake history of the pandemic and make stuff up, everyone would say that's not accurate. If it hit the #1 Times bestseller, because there's ways to do that without actually selling books, and it got on there, right? And there would be blog articles, there would be other books, there would be newscasts, there would be proof. So 100, 200 years from now, people could find my book that I wrote and said, the real revealed truth about the pandemic. And they're like, oh, well, hey, we found this document, maybe. But they'd find dozens or hundreds of other documents saying, no, it's called rebuttal evidence. That's not actually true. So the fact that these things were written so close to the events, there would have been countless people alive, not to mention the Roman government, who had a vested interest in this not being true. We would have rebuttal documents from that time period saying, there's this new cult out, because they referred to them in the beginning. A lot of people thought they were a cult. Hey, there's this new cult out, and they're writing all this stuff that is absolutely not true. And there'd be historical documents saying the opposite. So that alone is a good fact. And the reason it happens is because it's true. There's no way they could have written those things just like 40 years, 50 years later, and not had a record of people saying, none of this is real. This is all just a fairy tale. It's all just a cult. To put it in perspective, the two earliest biographies of Alexander the Great, so we all know, we don't know him, but we all know of Alexander the Great. We understand the history of Alexander the Great. Napoleon literally built his life around the histories of Alexander the Great. They were written, the two earliest ones were written by Arrian and Plutarch. I'm assuming that's how you pronounce it. They were written more than 400 years after, okay? So the two earliest biographies that we have of Alexander the Great, no one refutes that Alexander isn't real and didn't do what the histories say he did. The earliest two biographies were more than 400 years after him, and historians have compared it and said, hey, we've done all the research, and those two biographies seem very close to the truth. If they're not 100% true, they're very close. They're good. They're accurate. They're good enough that we can use them as history. 400 years. What's interesting is the next 500 years, a lot of legend about Alexander the Great developed. And so it takes out it's that second 500 years before legends really start to develop. So we can see, even if at the most liberal dating of the documents of the New Testament, we're talking 30, 40, and or 40, 50, and 60 years after the events happened. So not only would there have been rebuttal evidence if it was false, it's within the realm of the claim of like legends grow. They don't grow that fast. It takes too much time, okay? So that's not a case. So that alone right there proves that case isn't. So even that 60 years later is basically no time at all. But let's look at a conservative approach, okay? We've been talking about a liberal dating of these documents. If we look at a conservative dating, so it's going to be the opposite, right? Well, it could be this long. And let's look at the approach that says it could be this close to what actually happened. So if we look at a conservative approach, that puts Mark at AD 60, maybe even the 50s, and that's only 30 years after the resurrection. So we're talking about like, if you're 15 when the resurrection happens, you're still a young man at the time that you're writing about the resurrection. It's super close. And so by today's standards, that would essentially be almost like a news flash or a tweet or even like a TikTok video, like in comparison of how quickly it happened. We pull our phone out and we like, I just saw such and such happen go down at Walmart. You won't believe it. Like that kind of thing. Like, oh, it just happened not 10 minutes ago. In comparison, that's basically what these are. It just happened from a historical perspective. It could be as early as 30 years ago. So all those concerns are basically thrown out. And then, fun fact, don't get these out of order. There we go. The Bible is not in chronological order. I appreciate that. Thank you. The Bible is not written in chronological order. Have you guys ever go through a chronological Bible study? What's the first scripture? It's like Job, right? It's in Job. So they're not in chronological order. So we're talking about the Gospels. It's the first thing in the New Testament. But as far as a chronological order goes, Paul's letters came before that, okay? So before they decided, hey, you know what? We need to write some of this stuff down because it was an oral tradition. I'll get to that in a minute. An oral society. Writing wasn't their first go-to. And so, we need to write some of this stuff down. And before they even did that, Paul's writing letters because, he can't give an oral presentation because he either can't get to where they are or because he's in prison, depending on what part. So he's writing these letters. So those were even happening before that. So we're talking almost immediately, especially when you consider one of the first things Paul did when he really was like, I'm going to be an apostle, right? That's not how it happened, but let's just, for brevity, let's just say, when that kind of happened, one of the first things he did is he went to the other disciples and said, hey, okay, here's what I believe. And he basically preached to them, and the other disciples said, yeah, that's how it went down. That's good. Everything that God, said to you, we were there. That's legit. That happened. That's all accurate. It's all doctrinally accurate. It's all good. So we have almost immediately, we see that the story, we'll use the word story, the story of the gospel from the very beginning was accurate. And it's never been distorted or changed, okay? So that alone should give us a lot of confidence in what it is that we're reading and what we base our foundation on.